Welcome to Babes in Bookland, your favorite book club podcast that focuses on women's stories. I'm your host, Alex Franca, and today author Dorothy Roberts sits down with me to chat about her memoir, The Mixed Marriage Project. After her parents passed, Dorothy opened boxes containing nearly 500 interviews her white father conducted with interracial couples in Chicago, starting in 1937, almost 2 decades before he married her black mother. Inside those boxes, she found wild parties, a nudist camp, a club for mixed couples at the turn of the century, and a file labeled number 224. We talk about the stories her father never published, why she hid her father's whiteness from her classmates at Yale, and whether love, actual, intimate, everyday love, can dismantle racism. Spoiler alert, it's complicated. This one is tender, surprising, and it'll make you wonder what questions you should be asking the people you love while you still can. Let's get to it. Hello, Dorothy. Thank you so much for coming on Babes in Bookland.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. It's a real pleasure.
You have spent your career demanding that we all look closer at the systems designed to oppress. You tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And with the Mixed Marriage Project, your memoir, you invite us into something even more personal. Your memoir is its own marriage of sorts, a tender and curious examination of where you come from and how that's shaped you, and a fascinating and at times disheartening look into the perspectives and motivations and toll of decades of accounts of interracial marriages. With your memoir, you invite us all to take a closer look at our own lives and ask ourselves, how much of who we are shaped by the stories our own families believed or wanted to tell. Thank you so much for writing this memoir. I absolutely adored it, and I cannot wait to talk with you more about it right now.
That makes me feel wonderful. Thank you so much.
So before we get to the meat of the memoir, let's talk about your process, because this is a different type of work for you. Your memoir blends history, social analysis in a way that resists easy categorization. Did you have another book that you looked to that sort of showed you how to do all these things at once? Or did you sort of invent the form as you went?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that there's a particular book that quite is a model for mine. In a way, mine was very particular to my discovery of my father's interviews. And so following those interviews and my responses to it and thinking about how it related to my childhood and my family, my own identity, was the way I was motivated to write a memoir and the way I organized it. You know, the book that comes to mind that I relied on a lot for inspiration and information about the eras I was writing about is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns.
Okay.
You know, that book is nonfiction. It's not a memoir, but it contains stories. She writes it as the stories of 3 characters' lives to tell the story of the Great Migration. Right. And I found that very inspiring because of the way she weaves together stories and information and history to get across what the Great Migration was like, but focusing on these 3 fascinating characters. So for me, I was exploring with how I could use this fascinating stories of the couples that my father, later joined by my mother, interviewed as a way to tell the story, not only of mixed marriages in Chicago over several decades, but also my own story. So I added that personal aspect to it as well.
Yeah, and you do it very successfully. Now, if we have listeners out there who are unfamiliar with what the Great Migration is, could you just, very simply, obviously this is something your book encourages us all to dig deeper into history, but, just we don't want to leave anyone behind.
Sure. So the Great Migration is the name that has been given to the monumental migration of Black Americans from the South to the North to escape Jim Crow violence and to look for better jobs in the industrializing North. And it took place approximately after World War I, and you could say into the 1970s even.
Wow.
We're talking about millions of African Americans who left their homes in the South to come to the North to cities like Chicago and New York and Detroit, and also west to San Francisco and Los Angeles and other cities in the West Coast as well, but mostly the East, the Midwest, and the West. I guess that covers just about all of the United States.
They just fled the South, basically, is what
They were
happened.
fleeing the South. It was a combination of fleeing the terror of Jim Crow. And, many
Yeah.
of these people were sharecroppers earning practically nothing. It was really a system that was almost like slavery.
Right.
Lynchings going on and exploitation. And also the North provided the hope for better jobs. And so it was both to look for better jobs and to escape the racial violence of the South. Now, as I
Yes.
point out in my book, they didn't escape racial discrimination entirely.
Right.
And, interracial marriage is a good way of looking at that because in the South, all of the Southern states at that point still banned interracial marriage. It was a crime for a white person to marry someone who wasn't white.
Mm-hmm.
And those laws continued until really 16 states still had them when the Loving versus Virginia decision was made by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967, so not that long ago. The northern states, some of them had these anti-miscegenation laws, bans on interracial marriage, but they were repealed after the Civil War. So Illinois was repealed, and it was legal to marry interracially in Chicago in the 1930s, for example, when my father began interviewing couples there. But as the interview showed, these couples were still discriminated against by judges, police officers, landlords, hospitals, everyday people. They lived in what was called the Black Belt, which was created by white people in Chicago to confine the Black migrants from the South to a narrow strip of segregated neighborhoods. Black people, by and large, could not live in white neighborhoods in Chicago in the 1930s. And this was upheld by mob violence and racially restrictive covenants that banned the sale of property to Black people and other forms of discrimination. So it's interesting to think about the differences between the North and the South, but also some of the similarities in terms of racial discrimination that existed in Chicago, as well as in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, Georgia, southern states.
I think that was one of the most surprising parts of your book was this realization that just because there wasn't something outlawing it didn't mean that people were okay with it. And also the way Black women were treated who married white men versus the Black men who married white women. I mean, that was really fascinating.
Yes. So that was one of the most surprising aspects of these interviews. There was a club for interracial couples created by them in Chicago that started around the turn of the 20th century. And my father discovered it and was really keen to find the members of this club because it would let him have a whole list of people he could interview, right? A ready list of mixed marriage couples in Chicago, which, by the way, were difficult to find. So finding this list was a gold mine for him. But he noticed pretty soon that most of the couples were white women married to Black men, and he could not find Black women married to white men who were members of the club. And the members told him that they'd only known a handful, if that, of Black women married to white men. And when he asked them why, they disparaged Black women. They said the Manasseh women don't like colored women. That's what Black people were called at the time. And when he asked them why, and several of them said Black women, or again, they would say colored women, have looser morals. And this idea was that there were a lot of Black women sleeping with white men as their mistresses or just on the side, and they were not getting married. And instead of looking at what the taboos might have been that caused this to happen, instead they blamed Black women for being willing to have sex with white men without marrying them and called them loose. And this really perpetuates a long-standing stereotype that I've written about in my other work of Black women as being sexually licentious, having depraved morals. And this comes out of slavery because of the history of white male enslavers raping Black women and not wanting to take any account of it, not wanting to be punished for it. And so they started this stereotype of Black women as always being sexually available, that this wasn't any harm to Black women. The idea that Black women could not be raped because, according to the stereotype, they had no self-dignity. They had no care about their sexuality. And so their sexuality couldn't be violated. And of course, this is a horrible myth that has been very damaging to Black women. And so it was surprising to hear members of a club dedicated to interracial marriage to be repeating these stereotypes.
I think that was such a disheartening part of your memoir, was like, why do people do this? Why are we the way that we are? And obviously, if we could figure out the answer to that question, then we could solve so many things. But so much of it seems just to be coming from victim blaming, protecting the ego, not wanting to be the bad person, so the other person's the bad person. And you really see the ripple effects of that and how that is still playing out in such a huge way today.
So one of the reasons I wanted to write this memoir, and what I hope readers get from it, is that we need to really question the ways in which race and racism continue to govern our lives, shape our decisions, even our most intimate decisions, as well as our political decisions. I think that race and racism continue to be so dominant in U.S. society, and we often don't ask as deeply the questions we should be asking about it. And that's why interracial marriage, I think, is a very useful place to think about these questions. It really gets you to grapple with your deepest feelings and how your views, your either your desires or what repels you or attracts you, how that is shaped by racial stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think your book does do that. Let's talk about some of these couples that you include in your memoir. Were there more? How did you decide who to highlight? Which, your father did follow some of them through the decades, which was really neat. That was really neat to see the prolonged examination of their lives and how things changed. But were there any that you had to cut just for word count?
Oh my goodness, there were hundreds of them.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So I had almost 500 interviews between the 1930s to the 1960s. I decided to focus on those eras. My father continued to interview couples into the 1980s. So he had 100 years worth of interracial marriages because some of the couples in the 1930s had been married in the 1880s. So that's a span of 100 years of marriages. And I read all the interviews. And of course, I couldn't write about, hundreds of couples. I could have written a sort of sociological account or study of my father's research, but I wanted to highlight the stories that I found to be the most fascinating stories, or the most disturbing stories, or the most heartwarming stories. And so I picked the couples that meant the most to me, that taught me the most, and also the ones that my father liked the most as well. And as you said, he followed some of these couples over several decades, and many of them became friends with our family. So I could recognize, for example, the Albertis, he called them, this couple made up of a white man and Black woman who worked at the Chicago main post office. That's where they met each other. And they were an interesting couple, kind of racy couple. They had some pretty wild parties. And my father met them at a nudist camp to begin with.
That's right.
So this couple, my father, I couldn't tell where it was an interview and where it was a diary entry, what the conversations were, research conversations or personal conversations. And eventually, when I get to a point in the 1960s where my father writes in his notes that he picked me up from a sleepover at Mr. Albertis' house, I realized that Mr. Alberti's daughter was one of my closest friends growing up. And so it showed me that this story that he was creating through his interviews was also woven not only in his marriage to my mother, but also the story of my life growing up. And I, of course, picked the Albertis as one of the couples to follow in my memoir. I didn't reveal their actual names. These are all pseudonyms because my father promised that he wouldn't reveal their actual names, but I know exactly who this family is.
Let's talk about that line between researcher, analyst, and woman living her life and your father's research. How did you navigate that?
Well, the whole reason I was motivated to write this memoir and not just finish the book that my father never published. I could have just told the stories of these couples. They certainly would make a book all by themselves. But I was so motivated to tell how their stories interwove with my family story. That's why I decided to make it a memoir, because I couldn't disentangle the stories that came out of the interviews with the story of my childhood and my own parents' interracial marriage and my identity as a Black girl with a white father. Everything I read in the interviews and my parents' notes meant something to me. It all brought forth these memories and these questions about my own family and my own identity. And I really couldn't disentangle it. And so it turned out to be a memoir that weaves together the interviews and my life that follows the way that my parents wove together their research and their personal lives in every way, even to the point of becoming themselves an interracial couple.
Yeah.
I point out, I discover and write about this early in the memoir that throughout my entire life, up to the point I began reading the interviews, which was only in a decade ago, so I was already fully grown. I thought that my father became interested in studying interracial marriage and promoting interracial marriage because he fell in love with my mother. White anthropologist falls in love with Black student at Roosevelt College and then starts studying interracial marriage. But I find out that he actually started when he was 21 years old in 1937, long before he married my mother, almost 2 decades before he married my mother. They were married in 1954. That really totally upended the narrative that I thought I knew about my family and made me see even more clearly how his research was so intertwined with his personal life, with my family, that he created my family with my mother after doing more than a decade of research on this topic.
Yeah.
And so their lives were so intertwined between the research and their personal lives. And then my life was also, because growing up in the 1960s, my father was obsessed with this topic and writing this book. So the book really dominated my childhood. Growing up in Kenwood, an integrated neighborhood in Chicago, and he would bring in these interracial couples throughout my childhood. So his best friends, the plumber, my piano teacher, they were all mixed race couples.
Yeah.
And I really can't think of my childhood at all without putting this project at the forefront of everything we did, the people who came to our home, the parties that my mother threw.
Yeah.
The people we interacted with, my friends, their friends, and also, just as importantly, maybe even more profoundly, the lessons that my parents taught me about race, that there is only one human race, that we are all equal, that we have a common humanity that we should uplift, again, in every aspect of our lives, in our friendships, in our loving relationships, in our politics, in our schoolwork, or now eventually in my own career. It's a like a total interweaving
Yeah.
between this study of interracial marriage and promotion of it and my childhood, and then realizing as I'm working on the book how much it influenced my career as an adult as well.
You take us through that realization where you're like, wait, my dad was doing this before he met my mom. And then you were kind of waiting for your mom to come into the picture. And then when she
Yes,
finally did, you were like, there she is. But
yes.
did you ever get to have that conversation with your father? You talk about his brother, who was extremely racist, basically disowned your father after he married your mother. Did you ever
Mhm.
talk about where his anti-racism came from? How that was developed?
I never asked him about it, partly because I didn't realize how early on in his life he had developed that anti-racist position. You
Yeah.
know, I found in his papers college essays he wrote when he was 17 years old, speaking out against racism, really against white privilege. He writes in this Psychology 101 essay that he rejects the view that he's superior or any more intelligent because of his pure Nordic blood. He was German and Welsh. He rejects that view and he writes that people who aren't white are just as capable, but he has more privilege than them because he's white. And then he writes at the end, and that's true for men and women too. And I'm like, wow, Daddy,
You're so
you were
progressive,
challenging
Dad.
male intellects. So progressive in Psychology 101 in college. And
Yeah.
I knew growing up, he emphasized this, that when he was 16, he had already graduated from college, and his grandmother took him on a round the world trip to India, where his aunt was working as working and living in a tiny village as a missionary. He spent 6 months in this village in northern India where he was very open to the culture there. And I learned more about that because he kept a very detailed diary of this
Mhm.
whole year he was traveling. And he wanted to learn the language, the local language. He wanted to adopt the local customs, interact with the village boys. And I could see already that he had this very open-minded, non-judgmental view about other cultures. I'm not sure where that came from. He did grow up in a bilingual home. His grandparents spoke German and they lived on the second floor. He lived with his English speaking second generation German mother and his Welsh father on the first floor, but he was very close to his grandmother. And maybe that had something to do with it. I speculate in my memoir that I know that German Americans were discriminated against because they were the enemy. And so when he
Yeah.
was growing up, there was a lot of prejudice against Germans, and maybe that had an influence on him. But I just kind of growing up accepted that I had this very liberal father who believed very strongly in interracial relationships and was dedicated to ending racism in America. And he thought that interracial marriage was the answer.
Yes.
And so he lectured me about that. So I was very clear about that. I just had no idea that the origins of his views went back so far into his childhood.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see how much that contradicts with his brother, who was presumably raised
Yes.
the same way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But his brother didn't go on that trip to India.
Right.
And, I'll tell you something funny. I was giving a book talk at a bookstore. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but someone raised her hand and said, well, maybe could it be that his brother was jealous that his grandmother took your father and not him? And that's why he resented him. I don't think that's true. I also found a lot of photos of my father with his brother before my father got married.
Mm.
And they look like they're, best friends and
Yeah.
just very close to each other, which also drills down how sad it is that that my uncle disowned my father over his marriage to a Black woman.
That is really sad. And I think there is something to your point. When we get out of our bubbles, when we see the world, when we can acknowledge that other people are living lives happily in ways that we don't live our lives.
Yeah.
I just think that's so important. And not everybody obviously has the privilege to be able to travel to India, but you can read other women's memoirs. And you can watch TV shows and movies. I mean, there's really no excuse anymore. Get out of your bubble.
Exactly. I'm absolutely sure that trip around the world and living in India and accepting the people there and wanting to learn about their culture, that was critical to my father's views and made a big difference between his and his brothers.
Yeah. Before we get more into the meat of your memoir, I'm curious, both of your parents have passed.
Mm-hmm.
Was that just life happened? You didn't have time to go through these boxes. Do you wish that you would have been able to excavate this with both of your parents still here? Did you have questions for them that you'll never get answers to? Or do you feel like in some ways this was how it was meant to be and it's a little bit simpler that you get to do this? And you still have your sisters that you can talk to about everything that you found. And I'm sure that they've read the memoir and have all their own thoughts about your reflections.
Yes. I wish I knew the questions to ask my parents while they were still alive. I discovered a lot of it in reading my father's papers after both my parents died. So I didn't know to ask certain questions.
Yeah.
And I had a very busy career. I wrote 4 books before this one, and I could have, I suppose, gone through those boxes sooner than I did, but it just was such a monumental task. It just did not occur to me to do it. I had no idea I would find what I found in the boxes. Maybe if I had suspected that, I would have gone looking, but I just didn't know. I do have 2 sisters I'm very, very close to, Helen and Evelyn. They are only a year and 3 months younger than I am. They're twins, so we're almost like triplets.
Yes.
We experience everything I write in the memoir, except for that first year of my life together. And they were a great resource for me. I sent them each chapter as I concluded it and let them read it. I felt I had to share it with them. I know there's some memoirists who don't want to share their memoir with anybody until it's published, but I felt that this was also their story. And I didn't want anyone else to read it before them. They are the ones that have the greatest stake in it. And also, just selfishly, I wanted to hear their memories as well and see, did I misremember something or get confirmation that they remembered certain events and relationships the same way I did, which was mostly the case. Yes. And all 3 of us loved our childhood. We loved growing up in the house in Kenwood. We were very close to my parents. We dearly loved both of them. And we often reminisce about our childhood. So having this opportunity to reminisce and recount fond memories was really joyful experience. There was just, I mentioned Mr. Alberti, whom my father met at the nudist camp, and his wife threw a wild party I write about. One of my sisters did not want me to include that chapter. She asked me to take the chapter out. I entitle it The Bachelor. It's about my father's life and when he comes back from World War II after serving in the Army and before he meets my mother. And we had several conversations about it. I explained to her why I thought it was really important to include it. It's an important transition in my father's life and career and research. And Mr. Alberti was so close to him and clearly the most important relationship because my father has more notes and interviews with him than anyone else he interviewed. And I know from recognizing this family that they were close friends of my family. And I also think it's just interesting to explore both their experience at the nudist camp and at the party, this aspect of interracial mixing, whether being willing to, bear it all is
Literally.
literally is somehow related to some people's willingness to break the taboo against interracial intimacy. So I just thought that was an interesting topic. And obviously my father thought that was interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote about it in his notes. So he didn't refrain from writing about it. He put it in the papers along with the interview. So it wasn't a separate diary.
Mm-hmm.
It was along with the interview, transcribed interviews. Also, my parents are both deceased. So, my sister's main objection was she thought that my mother would be mortified by the public knowing about this aspect of my father,
Right.
which would be true if she were alive, but she's not alive. So I just, I made all these arguments to my sister, and she finally said, okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
She wouldn't have included it in her memoir.
There you go.
But she said, go ahead. And my other sister said at the end of this conversation where we finally resolved, I would put it in the book. She said, you can try to hide the truth, but it's still the truth. And, I don't think in a memoir you have to reveal everything.
Right.
But I do think you should be honest and transparent about the things that are really significant to the main themes of your memoir.
Yeah.
If you're trying to say something in your memoir, do you know what I mean? So I thought that chapter was critical. And that's why I wanted to tell that aspect of my father's life and leave it in.
Yeah. And it was fascinating and it was unexpected. I mean, you're reading through it and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, a nudist colony. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I'm glad you kept it in, but you're right. It is tricky when your story it also includes other people's stories, whom you love and respect, and whom people you love and respect, love and respect. Yes. It's all a balance, but you're right. At the end of the day, you were trying to tell your story the strongest way that you could, most truthful way that you could, and continue your father's story and continue his work and his book.
Right. And you know what else I think I intended this to be, and other people have told me that this is a very loving memoir. Yeah. It's not an attack on my parents.
No.
So when I include that, I think it's clear I'm including it because it's special to me and to my parents. It's something that reveals positive qualities about my father. I was shocked, believe me, Alex, when I got to that interview, I could hardly believe my eyes because my father was this devoted family man. Of course, I only knew him married to my mother, and he was so devoted to my mother and to our family. He seemed, I don't want to say conservative, but because he wasn't. Now I know how far from conservative he was. But both my parents had a kind of proper conservative edge to them, even though they were breaking all these rules and certainly didn't abide by the norms of society. They really lived by their principles and were willing to break rules in order to uphold their principles, which were beautiful principles. But we also had very, in a way, traditional family. My mother cooked dinner every evening, and my father joined us for dinner around the dining room table every evening. We were taught to do well in school. We were very obedient. So that image of my father was really blown apart by all of these stories that he revealed in his papers about his bachelor life.
Did it make you think? You have 3 sons and 1 daughter. Did it make you think, Dorothy, what are some stories from my, bachelorettehood?
I'll have to say, I don't think I was as wild as my father, which is amazing. Amazing. Again, it just flipped on its head, all these things I thought, because I would have thought I was much more free-spirited and left-wing, than my father. But turns out that may not be true. But there are aspects of my life that I think my children would be surprised about. I am much more open with my children about my past than my parents were. I think that's probably pretty average,
Yeah, generational.
Exactly. And, my parents were much closer to me than I know my mother was to her parents, because my grandparents were not at all open about their personal lives or their personal feelings.
Right.
My mother's parents lived with us for a couple of years. And I write in the memoir, I didn't have as close a relationship to them as I have to my grandchildren.
Right.
And I think that it probably is a generational thing. So I think there are fewer surprises that my children would find in my papers, but who knows?
I thought it was really poignant though when you said I didn't know to ask these questions, and it just makes me, I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and obviously our lives are just so much more documented and recorded now.
Yes.
I was talking to a friend and she was like, what a gift. Your daughter one day will be able to listen to all of your podcast interviews with these women and she'll get to know you through them. And I was like, oh, that is true and weird. And what am I revealing about myself?
Yes.
Learning about our parents and their lives, being a parent yourself, how does that change the way that you move forward in those relationships with your children and your grandchildren? Are there questions that my kids don't know to ask me?
Yes. Well, it certainly makes me want to share more with my children. Again, we have I think, a very honest and open relationship with each other. The other day, I was at workshop kind of thing, and the organizer said to the group, who is the person you feel you can share your secrets with? Who is both honest with you, but also very caring, so you feel you can open up to them? And the first person that popped into my head was my daughter. We've always been so close from when she was little.
That's lovely.
All the way till today. And one of my favorite years of my life was when I had a fellowship at Harvard. I was a professor, and she was the youngest of then my 3 children. So I had 2 older boys and my daughter. And I decided that I would go to Cambridge. We were living in New Jersey at the time with my daughter, and I left the boys behind with my then husband and their father. And we had such a great time together. She was 7. She turned 8 while we were there.
Great age.
And oh my goodness, we did everything together. And she went to a public school in Cambridge, and we would meet after school every day, and we'd go on road trips together. We drove back to New Jersey every other weekend together. We listened to Mariah Carey and Luther Vandross.
Yes.
We still have that relationship to this day. We love to travel together, and she's the person I can share my secrets with. So I feel that I already do share a lot with them, but there are aspects of my romantic and married life, my life with their father, that they don't know all the details of. My fascinating marriage to my first husband, who is the father of all 4 of my children, who was a political activist in New York City. And
you mention him in the memoir. I
mention him in the memoir, but there's so many other aspects of it that are they're unbelievable. That's the thing. They're unbelievable, but they're true.
If you have a story inside of you, I personally feel like those things eat at you. They demand to be told. And it sounds like this story is demanding to be told. And you, Dorothy, I trust you will find the best way to tell it.
Yeah.
So I love that you bring up your marriage to your husband.
Mhm.
You talked about earlier about your dad's thesis was basically that interracial marriage, mixed marriage, was a step forward in promoting racial equality.
Yes.
But you seemed to disagree with that thesis.
Yeah.
What did you discover about that thesis in particular, your thoughts on it?
Mhm.
Talk me through what you felt before you started this project.
Mhm.
And then has that changed at all now?
So my father and I had many, many conversations about his view that interracial marriage would promote racial equality. In fact, that it was the best way to promote racial equality. Almost like lectures. When I imagine them, I think of him, at a chalkboard, pointing to graphs and charts and giving me the statistics to prove his point. Although these were all at home and he never was in front of a chalkboard. But it was just the way he would try to convince me of his thesis. And when I was very little, I adopted it. I believed it. I can remember when I was very young, maybe 5 or 6 years old, liking to skip down the street with my parents, with my mother on one side and my father on the other side, and me in between, as if we were a billboard for interracial relationships.
Yeah.
The showing the public, look at my happy family. We can get along. We
Yeah.
can build families together. We don't have to let race divide us. But by the time I was in middle school, I started to doubt that. And I know by the time I was in high school, I absolutely did. I also, at that time, began to identify completely as Black. And as I write about later on in college, I even hid the fact that my father was white.
Yeah.
Even though we had a very close relationship, I didn't disown him or anything. I just didn't want people in college to know, my Black friends in college to know that my father was white. So my views changed a lot over my childhood. And in my career, as someone whose writing is all about the meaning of race and the harms of racism and racial hierarchy, I never wrote about anything positive about interracial marriage. My writing is all about the kind of struggle and changes in ideology, the changes in policy and practices that we would need to dismantle racial structures and racial ways of thinking. So I came to writing the memoir, to reading my father's papers. I started reading them before I decided to write a memoir.
Yeah.
At the beginning of reading his papers and thinking about my memoir, I held on to that view. And I still hold on to the view that the answer to ending racism and promoting racial equality is not through personal relationships, or I should say, not through interracial intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
I do think personal relationships are important, but I don't think that interracial relationships are the answer.
It's not that simple.
Yeah. In other words, I don't think that interracial relationships by themselves are enough to dismantle racism. Now, my views did change as a result of writing my memoir and reading these interviews, which I did in conjunction with each other. So I'm reading the interviews as I'm taking notes and writing down my ideas, which turned into my memoir. So I can't disentangle my memoir from the interviews or vice versa. By the end of reading all the interviews, I began to think more carefully about the role of personal relationships in ending racism. Again, I've always been very structural and institutional in the ways that I think, very policy oriented in the ways I think and write about racism. And I began to think that our personal relationships do count for something in the struggle to end racism. I think that they can't do it by themselves, but I think we do have to ask ourselves, how we conduct our lives personally and how that relates to whatever we're doing to promote racial equality. That doesn't mean we have to marry someone of another race.
Yeah.
It does not mean we have to adopt a child of another race. It does not mean we have to be intimate with someone of another race. But it does mean that we have to see that our intimate relationships, the way we raise our children, the way we conduct our intimate lives, the way we conduct our friendships, they are related to what I would say is our obligation to work against racism and to build a multiracial democratic society where everyone is treated equally.
Yeah.
That I became much clearer about. That was something that my parents' interviews, my parents' views about race and our common humanity have influenced my thinking. I mean, I realize more that those lessons they taught me have really shaped my career and my personal life as well. For example, I have always thought it was very important to engage with the people I'm writing about. I've written several books about institutions that oppress Black people, but especially that devalue Black women, especially Black mothers. And it's always been important to me to engage with impoverished Black mothers who are fighting to keep their children, to be able to put food on the table, and are organizing to change policies. I've never written just from, my office and without engaging with the people I'm hoping to serve.
Right.
And so for me, my research has always been very much entangled with my personal life.
Yeah.
But it didn't occur to me how that was related to the way my parents conducted their research and their personal lives until I worked on this memoir.
Oh, that's such a lovely realization to have. And as you were speaking, it just made me think like it's when we see each other and value each other in those intimate relationships that like collectively we decide we want better for one another.
Exactly.
And when you just focus on the institutions, you forget that there are very real people hurt inside of those institutions and being hurt by those institutions, and very real people propping up those institutions.
Yes.
You have to put the faces and names to those people.
That's very true. That's very, very true. And in my own work, even before I wrote my memoir, but I was gravitating toward this, and it was affirmed by my memoir writing that we have to address both those individual biases along with the institutional discrimination and oppression and devaluation. As you said, there are people who are putting into place these unjust policies, and their prejudices and their unjust ways of thinking promote these unjust policies. And then the unjust policies promote these unjust ways of thinking.
Yeah.
They're both equally as important, and even more important is seeing how they reproduce each other, how they mutually support each other. And so at the same time, we have to see within our own lives how these unjust ways of thinking may still be affecting the way in which we lead our personal lives, as well as the work that we do to topple unjust policies, practices, institutions, and systems.
And your parents' work was their effort to help end racism.
When he conducted his very first interview of Mrs. Alberts on February 19th, 1937, he knocked on her door and he said, "We're conducting a study of whether the racial caste system in Chicago is similar to the one in Natchez, Mississippi." He was doing research on what he called the racial caste system in Chicago, and he wanted to end it. he saw interracial marriage as a path to end the racial caste system. So he didn't at all think at any point, even from the beginning to the time he was doing research in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that racism had ended. And so we can now love each other as equal human beings. No, he thought loving each other as equal human beings would be a path to ending this persistent racial caste system in America. And, one thing that's possible as to why he never wrote the book is that he became more and more disillusioned about whether or not his prescription for ending the racial caste system was working. Because he'd been at it since he was 21 years old in the 1930s. And here he is in the 1980s, still trying to promote interracial marriage, but not seeing the kind of overcoming of racism that he had expected. He still was obsessed with interracial marriage, but it may be that he had become disillusioned and didn't think he could write the book that he had planned to decades earlier.
I think that's really smart speculation. And he had two opportunities. And then, he could never finish the book. And this is sort of your gift to him and his legacy.
In a way, it's the book he never got. He never finished and never published. He, in 1969, and I can remember when this happened, he got a contract from Simon & Schuster, this major publishing house in New York City, and a $2,000 advance, and which was a lot of money back then. And we were so excited that he finally was going to publish this book he'd been working on, my entire childhood. He never submitted the manuscript and had to return the advance. And then shortly after that, his editor got him another contract from G.P. Putnam's Sons, another New York publisher. He never submitted the manuscript to them either. And I found in his papers a whole manila folder filled with letters from editors at several publishing houses, including several academic presses that were very interested in the book. In fact, I was trying to remember which academic press it was, but one of them, an editor, wrote to him and said, "We're really interested in your book, but this is really 3 books." She wrote, "This is a book about the history of interracial marriage. It's a book about the interviews, the stories of people's lives, and it's a book about the children of interracial marriages," because by that point in the 1980s, my father had conducted hundreds and hundreds of interviews of the children of the people he interviewed, the couples he interviewed, as well as additional children in addition. So he had the makings of another book on children of interracial marriages.
Well, and let's talk about one of those children that he kept records on. You discover that you are one of your father's case numbers.
Yes.
And you put this in your epilogue. I was like, wow. Honestly, it was a really interesting choice. Walk me through discovering that. And then talk to me about your own reckoning with being the daughter of a white man and a Black woman.
I decided after I read all the interviews of the couples that I would just glance through the hundreds and hundreds of interviews, the children, going through them. I didn't read them carefully. I'm just flipping through, and I find this file number 224. And when I open it, it has documents about me. So I realize interviewee number 224 is me. And I was once again just blown over. I was a research subject too. This is unbelievable.
Yeah.
My first thoughts, as when I discovered when my father started this project before he married my mother, were we research subjects? Were we part of his research? in a way, I knew that we were part of his research because he told us so much about it, because he lectured me about his thesis about interracial marriage, because he brought so many interracial couples into our home, and because he wanted me and my sisters to be proof that interracial families could work. There was this myth that any child whose parents were of different races would have social and psychological, maybe even biological problems because they couldn't belong to either community. And so they would be lost and depressed and have all of these traumas as a result. And this is a longstanding myth. There's this image of the tragic mulatto who isn't Black or white, isn't accepted by anyone. And he wanted to prove that his children dispelled that myth. And that was part of the reason why it was so important to him and my mother, although she just wanted us to do well in school for other reasons, but that we would do really well in school. So I knew that we were important to his research. I did not know that he had a file on me. And in that file is an essay I think he must have asked me to write. It's in longhand, and then there's a typed version, which I believe he must have typed up. It really describes my whole trajectory in terms of my identity as his daughter. And so it describes how I used to be proud to be a member of an interracial family, but it soon veers into why I think of myself solely as a Black girl, and then into how I hid his identity as a white man from my schoolmates in college, describing incidents where I deliberately not only failed to mention, but really hid the fact that he was white and why I did it. Now, I'm writing this, I believe it's the summer after my first year of college. So I'm writing it when I'm still trying to hide him.
Yeah.
His identity. So I'm writing it to explain in positive terms why I would want to hide his identity. And reading it now, decades later, it seems so hurtful, so heartless, so mean to my father, whom I love so dearly. And to write it for his eyes, it just, I could hardly believe I did that. But I felt so strongly about it at the time. And he must have asked me to write it. And we had a very honest relationship with each other. And I wanted to write my true feelings in it. And I don't recall it ever creating any kind of rift between us. We still had a very close relationship, but I just had this side of me that at school where I wanted to hide the fact that he was white.
Why?
Because when I got to Yale, there was this very close-knit group of Black students. This is the 1970s. I started college in 1973, and colleges were not as diverse as they are today.
Yeah.
And so there was, I can't tell you how many, but it was enough for all of us to know each other.
Yeah.
And to engage in activities together. And it was also an era of Black is beautiful and Black power. We all had big afros. Well, actually, I came to school with braids because my mother would braid my hair, and I immediately got them cut off. So I had a short afro. Okay. I had what they call a teeny weeny afro, but we all wore these natural hairstyles, and we were all very Afrocentric, and so I thought that I might not be as close to them. It wasn't that I thought they would reject me altogether, but I thought it would diminish, my credentials as part of this very close, coherent Black group if they knew my father was white. I think I just didn't want to risk having anything that would interfere with my relationship with them. And that's my best recollection of why. I just know that I can still feel the terror I felt when, in situations where they might find out my father was white. I remember when I was in a sociology class that first year of college, and in a small group session, we were asked to identify each other's identity to see if we could do it accurately. And someone in the group said, I think she's got some European ancestry. Everyone else just said she's Black.
Yeah.
And the instructor looked at me and said, Dorothy, is that true? And I could still feel how my stomach clenched. What am I going to say? And I said, well, my grandmother's white, but she died before I met her. So, which was true.
Right.
Which was true. My German grandmother, I never met her. She passed away before my parents were even married. In fact, my father waited to marry my mother until she died.
Right.
So he wouldn't upset her.
Right.
So that was absolutely true. But obviously, the honest response would be, yes, my father's white. And I didn't want to let them know that.
Yeah.
Even my boyfriend that first semester, he didn't find out that my father was white until I brought him home to meet my parents during spring break the following spring. And he's told me that when my father came to the door, he was completely shocked that he was white.
I do think it's interesting where you went from a place where being the daughter of a mixed marriage was celebrated.
Yeah.
To this place where you were almost, I don't feel like ashamed is quite the right word, but
I don't know if ashamed is the right word. It is so context specific.
Okay.
I wouldn't have been ashamed in other contexts, like with my family, with my Jamaican relatives, wouldn't be ashamed. It was this particular context, this particular time in the 70s, a new group of Black schoolmates I had just met, not sure about their feelings about race. All of that made me reluctant to let them know. I'm not sure what the right word is to describe.
You just wanted to fit in. We all want to fit in.
Exactly. Yeah. I wanted to fit into this particular group. And part of it also was I had been grappling with my own identity. I had grown up with a white father, a Black mother. I had gone through these stages of my identity, and I was at a point where I really wanted to affirm my Black identity for myself. And that's when I went to college, while I'm in that stage. So all of that came together to make me reluctant to reveal the so-called white side of me.
Yeah. We're all just exploring ourselves, especially in college. You're just trying to figure out who you are amidst who other people are sort of trying to tell you are.
Yes.
Yeah.
At a point where it's still hard to stand up for your own identity and say, I don't care what you think.
Yes.
I really, writing this memoir is the first I've really been able to say that.
Yeah.
There are still people, I've had people comment on Instagram or, other social media that if you have a white parent, you can't identify as Black.
Ooh.
There's all sorts of interesting ideas about racial identity because racial identity is all made up. It's all made up.
It's so true.
I have a white father. In some cultures, maybe I would be considered white. I have just as much European ancestry as African ancestry. In U.S. society, I want a Black identity. But I realize that's because of the particular historical, social, cultural context I'm growing up in and I'm living in now.
Yeah.
It depends on so many things. I've had people say, well, it depends on whether it's your father or your mother that's Black. Because if your mother is Black, then you can identify as Black. But if your mother's white, there are all these rules about identity. And so as now, at my old age, when I'm about to retire, and after I've written 5 books, I can finally say, yes, I have a white father who had a huge influence over my life, including my identity as a Black woman, and whom I loved and still love dearly. And I identify as a Black woman.
Amen. Is all I have to say to that. Dorothy, seriously, I feel like I could continue talking with you for hours. You are an incredible soul. I have a couple of questions that I ask all my authors as we wrap up. I think our conversation will encourage people to pick up your memoir, which at the end of the day is always my goal personally.
Thank you.
Okay, Dorothy, what is your favorite word?
Well, I don't know if it's because of my memoir, but the word love came to mind right away.
Yeah. How do you stay hopeful today?
The joy I have with my children and with the Black mothers who are organizing to build a better world, and our legacy of Black mothers throughout history who have come together to support each other and their children and have had victories along the way under more difficult circumstances even than we're confronting today.
Okay, that sentence makes me hopeful because it feels like we're in very difficult circumstances right now. So
but it's been worse, and Black mothers
have prevailed. Yes.
Have prevailed.
Yes. Okay, and then I have my little Babes in Bookland question jar. Okay. Ooh. What is a song that immediately puts you in a good mood?
I'm trying to think of the name.
You can sing it. You can sing it if we need to.
Oh God. See, it would probably be a Marvin Gaye song because I really like Marvin Gaye.
Okay.
And, there's so many songs though. Or it could be a Bob Marley song, but my mind is just blanking. All the songs have flown up my head. Like if they were on, I'd know every single word of them.
I know. Now I just have Let's Get It On stuck in my head, which is...
Oh. We could use that.
Okay.
It does put me in a good mood.
Perfect then.
It's not too steamy though, is it?
Oh, it's steamy, but you know what? It's worth it.
Okay, we'll do that.
But seriously, if you're in a bad mood and Let's Get It On comes on, like as soon as that like, no, like you're just like,
exactly.
You don't need to get it on in order to still be in a good mood.
Exactly. We're going to use that. Marvin Gaye, he always puts me in a good mood because I just think he's the best.
Okay, Dorothy, I'm going to let you get on with your day. I've taken up too much of your time, but you were amazing. Thank you.
You are too. Thank you so much. This was great.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all so much for listening today. If this conversation moved you, please share it with a friend, leave a rating. It's the easiest way to help indie podcasts like this one, championing women's stories. And if you'd like to further support the show, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Patreon for exclusive bonus content. Next week, I'm rerunning my Horse Barbie episode. Horse Barbie is a memoir by Gina Rosero, the Filipina trans model and activist who was crowned a pageant queen at 15, moved to New York, built a modeling career while keeping her trans identity hidden for nearly a decade, and then came out on her own terms in a TED Talk that changed everything. It's a story about beauty, reinvention, secrecy, and the radical joy of being seen exactly as you are. This is a book club episode. Happy Pride!